Hi, I'm Lana Swartz, and I'm an assistant professor in the Media Studies department here, and I'm thrilled and honored to introduce Bill to give a talk today. I first met Bill when I was a wayward graduate student in Los Angeles and searching for other scholars who were interested in thinking about the technologies of money. And it just so happened that the leading scholar in the world who was thinking about things in the way I was beginning to think about things was just a couple hours south of me at UC Irvine. And we met in the middle in Long Beach at a cafe at like 7 in the morning on a Saturday, where he holds informal office hours for members of the community, local politicians, activists, and wayward graduate students such as myself who just want a little piece of his time. Bill is a tremendous scholar who thinks about things in innovative ways. He's unbelievably productive. He's the author of numerous books, including most recently How Would You Like to Pay from Duke, and a co-edited collection, co-edited with me. So we've come a long way since that coffee shop, called Paid from MIT Press. He is also a tireless champion of the public university. He has served as dean at UC Irvine for a number of years, where he's worked very hard to ensure the present and the future of the California system. And yeah, I just couldn't be happier. And I think and I can't wait to hear what he's been up to most recently in this talk.
Oh, and one more thing.
One more thing I wanted to mention is that he runs a fascinating center called the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion, which funds researchers from all over the world, so 40 countries, who are doing research in their home country, living and working and doing research on technological and financial practices with the ultimate goal of poverty alleviation. And if you want to catch him and ask him about the fascinating interactions that these scholars have had with each other, it's really something. Okay, that's all.
Thank you so much, Lana. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. In this fabulous room. This is actually the second time that I have spoken in this room. The last time was a number of years ago on Halloween, and I was just reminded that I brought with me the hotel's Bible and held it upside down and talked and played Night on Bald Mountain and did all kinds of stuff. So I really want to thank the folks at Cyber Innovation Society here at UVA for having me out, and in particular Jack and Cody Fleming, who gave me a great tour this morning of the place, and Alf Weaver, as well as Lana Swartz and Kevin Driscoll and Kath Weston and everyone, Geeta Patel, everyone else who has just been so great and welcoming on this trip this time. So without any further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of what I've been thinking about lately. And there are slides. I don't know if you're going to be able to see everything, but I think that it'll be okay. And I'm going to start with this. This is Ulysses S. Grant's collar on a $50 bill. And this is sort of in many ways, where I get my title, That Touch of Money, and the inspiration. So I'm inspired a little bit in this talk today by counterfeit detection devices built into US banknotes. And they're going to help me tell you a story about infrastructure's materiality and immateriality and the implicit political theories that are in our various payment devices, things like cash, electronic transfers, cryptocurrencies, and platform companies, among other things. And you actually won't see it here. I don't think you can see it from where you're sitting. But if you could, you would see one of the counterfeit detection devices built into our banknotes. There's microprinting on Grant's collar. And it says the United States of America. It's right. And there's microprinting all over all of our banknotes if you want to kind of take a look and play around. What's interesting, though, about that particular feature is that tellers and cashiers who actually detect counterfeits almost never detect them through those sorts of visual features. Not the watermark, not any of the kind of hues that are now in our money. What they say is that the tell is always the touch. The tell is the touch of money. Didn't feel right. And what they're feeling is actually the effect of the intaglio printing process that we use to produce our banknotes. Very high pressure printing that produces the things like the lines in Grant's lapel that impart to our money a particular texture. That's the feel. The feel's really interesting to me. I'm kind of also inspired by folks who think about feel and texture and surfaces and haptics and vibration as a function of movement over a surface. And I've got a quote here from Bobby Klatsky and Susan Lederman, who are cognitive scientists who work on touch. I won't read it, but what's interesting to me is that the kind of folks who do sensory science tell us that what we're touching isn't actually the bumps on the surface of the note. What's happening is the infolding of our skin into the grooves that then permit the perception of that texture as we move our finger over the thing. To me, that's really kind of compelling to think with, that it's the infolding of our bodies into the note that give the tell of the touch of money. And I want to reflect on that kind of infolding of us into payment devices in general and what that might tell us about how we should think about technologies of money as we think about new innovations in payment. So here is an old floppy disk. What I'm going to argue today is that many of our digital systems for money and payment can reveal a similar interpenetration of bodies, systems, and worlds. The philosopher of computing, Brian Cantwell Smith, could have been describing any of today's digital value transfer systems in his discussion of all the work necessary to preserve digital media so as to read it in the future. And he was thinking about things like these 8-inch floppy disks. He says, the surrounding structure of routines and mechanisms in this case, the floppy consists of, the file formats, the standards, the motor speeds, and all those things. He says those only propped up the digital abstraction that is supposedly the raison d'etre for the technology. He goes on, the digital is, quote, sustained by complex networks of mechanisms, procedures, and normative policies. And those routines, mechanisms, and normative policies, I would add, and I'll demonstrate today, I hope, were political achievements. Now, we don't normally put computational processes and political processes in the same frame. But I want to argue quite strongly that the kind of tomorrow that we envision today for cyber innovations in society depends a lot on how we can see the political in the computational right now so that we can start imagining alternative futures for what we want there to be becoming. Now, the way I'm going to do this is, so I could say that I had a grand scheme, but really I had like 3 different things that I wanted to do and talk about and like present to you, and I couldn't quite figure out which one to pick. So I decided I was going to do them all and give you a little taste of 3 bits of my research and then get into some more stuff. So I'm going to start with 3 different ways to start the talk on how to give a talk on payments technology today, because there's an awful lot going on in the domain if you are following this at all, and even if you're not, just your everyday experience of trying to pay for things has changed a lot just in the past few years. I'm then going to kind of dip into the anthropology and archaeology of money for a bit. I'm an anthropologist by training. It's what I do. We have the arrogance to feel that we get to talk about the entire world in every culture in all of historical context. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to get into a bit about how records are made and maintained and why that matters, and then get into this question of the politics and the political futures of payment. So first start, let's talk about cryptocurrencies and initial coin offerings, just because. So one of the things that Lana didn't mention about one of our first meetings, I don't think it was the very first meeting, it might have been like the second one, at the same coffee shop in Long Beach. We were sitting there and I got an email from a colleague who was then at USAID, and she CC'd me and another pal of ours who used to be at the Atlanta Fed, and said, what is this Bitcoin thing? And it was like 2010, or 2011, it was early. And I was like, I don't know. And Lana knew a little bit. The other person we were with, Taylor Nelms, knew a little bit too. Our friend at the Fed put one of her interns on it, an undergraduate intern, who kind of went away and did whatever research she did and came back the next day with an email that she CC'd to all of us, explaining basically what Bitcoin was and saying that this would never reach the Fed's level threshold of concern for regulatory policy, which is kind of just like very confidently, this will never reach our threshold for regulatory concern. And she was kind of right in many ways. And in terms of something that would challenge the money, Bitcoin is sort of nowhere. It's still a teeny tiny little thing. But what's interesting about it to me, and in some of the work work that Lana and I subsequently did is the way that it inserted itself into a conversation about changing money and technology right at the moment of the financial crisis. And what I've got here is the so-called Genesis block, the first Bitcoin block that was put out there into the world by the coders. And you'll see if you convert it into ASCII, there's this little message about the bank bailouts. It says, the Times, 03, January 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks, right? Referencing the Financial Times headline of the day. Now, having started to study it pretty quickly after that initial email conversation in the Portfolio Coffee House in Long Beach, I was routinely ribbed by our deans of engineering and computer science for even paying attention to this thing, right? I was always teased, like, oh, how's Bitcoin doing today, da, 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 da. This past summer, one of them buttonholed me and wanted to sit down and talk about Bitcoin, right? I'm like, oh, interesting. And another one's wife was organizing a whole cryptocurrency event for Orange County's Tech Accelerator Tech Trends Conference. So that was kind of interesting. And but when my father-in-law, though, and a guy at the gym I go to both start getting into the business of cryptocurrency mining, I'm reminded of the time right before the financial crisis when one of my neighbors started explaining to me what real estate investment trusts are. So, there's a bubble here, and let's not forget that. And the bubble, though, in many ways, leads to, invitations to give talks like this. I just sort of want to acknowledge that. It's in the consciousness, it's in the ether. It's sort of a crazy thing. But this isn't the first bubble. The first bubble is sort of 2013, 2014, when Bitcoin reached, I'll show you a graph in a second, but it reached around like 600 or 700 to 900 to the Bitcoin after having been, nothing from its inception in 2009. At the annual payments industry conference, Money 2020, which takes place every year in Vegas, it's actually happening right now. And one of my research assistants is there, doing field work for me. And one of Lana and my co-authors, Taylor Nelms, is giving a talk there. In 2013, people went around stickering the exhibit hall and doing things like this. And I don't know if you can see it because it's kind of a poor quality picture, but someone taped up a piece of paper that just has written in pen, email sign up at coinbase.com for $1 of free Bitcoin. Okay, this is Money 2020, 2013, big payments industry conference. You get this kind of guerrilla stickering and people putting up signs. 1 year later, Bitcoin and blockchain have become integrated into the program as one of the three main tracks, right? So there's a huge amount of interest that took place there between 2013 and 2014. There's that initial blip, that bubble back then. Here is where we are now. And Bitcoin today is like 6,300 to the dollar or so. What's happening this time around, so that first bubble really brought Bitcoin into the consciousness of the payments industry, the industry that's responsible for the electronic transfer of value. So think the card networks, PayPal, the interbank clearance and settlement networks, which I'll talk about in a little bit, the wire services and so on. This time around, this other thing is going on, where we're seeing a rush of what people call initial coin offerings. Lots and lots of money going into startups, all of which are on a particular kind of model. They write a white paper that explains their concept and what they're going to do with a cryptocurrency. And sometimes it's their own cryptocurrency that they're going to make, or sometimes they're sitting on top of another one. Tons and tons and tons of speculative interest in the thing. And over this past summer, working off of an NSF grant that supported my own work on blockchain and cryptocurrencies for the past couple of years, I pulled in some undergrads from computer science and informatics to help me think about this, because I am not a computer scientist, and it's nice to have computer scientists to explain things to me sometimes, especially in this crazy, crazy world, and also to get them to think more critically about the ICO landscape. And I'm just going to present a little bit of what they found just by going through ICO white papers and coding them for various kinds of features. And one of the first interesting things is almost all of these things are built on the Ethereum platform. And if folks want to talk about that later, we can. But what's interesting to me is, Ethereum was built to be codable, so it's not really a surprise. It's easier than working with some of the other ones. But the next thing that was fascinating to me, and you'll have to forgive the typo here. This is done by my students, and industry is misspelled, but there you are. You probably can't see this from where you're sitting. But in spite of all the hype about blockchain will change supply chain management, blockchain will change, agriculture, blockchain will change shipping, blockchain will change facilities maintenance, all this stuff, almost all of the startup activity is basically in finance and payments. And those are the big teal and whatever color that is. Those two colors. This other is mostly, the other here is mostly folks doing their own coin, right? So that could maybe also be folded into the same domain. So the game is still very much what it was originally, which was this idea that you could disintermediate the existing financial intermediaries while using the rhetorical features of investment to get people to give hand over their money, right? So ICO sounds like IPO, and obviously this is of concern to the SEC, which can see right through this stuff. But there's an interesting kind of corollary to the idea that all of this is just speculative madness luring naive investors. Another thing that's come about in the course of this research is that for many people involved in this space, particularly women and people of color, ICOs provides an avenue into access to capital and finance that they feel that they would not have had otherwise. As one person put it to me, look, I didn't go to the right school, I don't belong to the clubs, I don't get invited to Sand Hill Road. Right? I don't look the way that you're supposed to look to get invited to Sand Hill Road. This gives me a way to raise $1 million without needing the venture firms. So what does this tell us about kind of those surrounding structures and mechanisms and normative practices that Cantwell-Smith said, informed the floppy disk? This tells us something about capital formation, race and gender, and labor hierarchies in computing today that are going into the making of this space that's sort of still adjacent to money and payment. Let's start a second time. Talk about China. Since we're in ICO land, and since I had two undergraduate students from China assisting me this summer, I was like, let's make use of the Chinese people's expertise. So they dug into ICOs in China. And again, hey presto, what you discover is, again, almost all of them are built on Ethereum, and again, almost all of them are in payments and finance. And again, you can't really see it, but the big, huge one is payments. Not all the other things that people talk about blockchain being used for. So I think, yeah. So the main focus in China right now is still the focus is on payments and finance, like the rest of the blockchain market. There's limited attention to things like supply chain, even though everybody talks about supply chain, like the rest of the blockchain market, and everybody's using Ethereum, like the rest of the market. What's interesting, though, is when you map the kind of place of incorporation of these startups, you see this pattern, and again, the coding is a little messy here, so you'll forgive me and my students, but you'll see that for the most part, it's the US, the other big red dot in that lower right corner is Singapore, and then China stands out. Switzerland stands out a little bit, so does the UK. That's place of incorporation, where you look at where the team is actually located, the coders. Where are the coders who are doing this, to the extent that we're able to learn it from the material we have. Singapore shrinks a little bit, China gets a little bit bigger. So we've got this pattern. Oops. Go back. We've got this pattern, essentially, of startups incorporating in Singapore and then making use of Chinese coders. And so there's another interesting sort of element to this, and we dug into this a little bit further over the summer, where some of what's happening in the blockchain space in China is about Chinese coders essentially saying to the global market, we're here, we're open for business. Do you need a coder for whatever? Don't look at India, look over here, here we are, right? It doesn't have anything necessarily to do with blockchain or crypto at all. It's a vehicle for getting into a market and saying, we're here. The product is not the ICO, but the Chinese coder. And interestingly, a lot of these folks will create English language LinkedIn pages, right, to kind of get people to them. And there's more to say about that as well. But again, what is the kind of like socio-material surround of the blockchain industry in China? It's about international labor markets and about the kind of emergence of a group of professionalized coders from China who want to participate in global labor. Now, of course, the other big thing happening in China right now is the rise of mobile all-in-one apps for payment and essentially everything else, like WeChat Pay and Alipay. And if you're not familiar with these these are things that sort of from within the app you can both pay, and it's done using a QR code. You scan a QR code and so forth with your camera. But also kind of everything else, like buying a flight, ordering food to be delivered, buying movie tickets, ordering someone to be a dog walker, like gig economy stuff, getting a ride, blah, 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 all completely within one of the two main apps. And you know, there's been a lot of foreign attention to this stuff, and from the US press and other places saying, oh no, this is horrific, this is Big Brother, especially if the Chinese state is also looking at this data, you know, what sort of trade-offs are happening around privacy. In some interviews that I did and that my students did, you know, one of the things that people say is that, you know, when we're talking about that these things provide convenience, what they're really talking about is that this provides kind of a certain kind of guarantee that what I'm purchasing is priced fairly and what I'm purchasing is what it is in a market that's a low trust environment. Right? So when I go to the store and I want to buy chicken, I want it to be chicken and not something else. If I want to buy rice, I want it to be rice and not like little plastic beads that look like rice. And there's this idea that having all of this stuff recorded, having a digital paper trail, so to speak, even if the government is in there, provides that level of trust in this otherwise low trust environment. And you know, we sort of maybe get worried about this kind of thing, but then, you know, right now, like my phone is transmitting everything that I do to Google and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and somehow that's not a problem, even though Google is a mess. And, you know, if we want to talk about the Wild West, we can talk about what's happening with the big platform companies in Silicon Valley right now. Now, kind of laminated on top of these services in China now is the ability to harvest all of the data that they're generating to generate things like alternative credit scores. And this is Sesame Credit, which is the product of Alipay. It is not the same as China's social credit scheme, which you've probably heard about. That's sort of a different system. And again, like it generates these sort of Orwellian fears, but I would just urge us to place it in you can keep your Orwellian fears, but place it in the context of a market that doesn't work the way that our market currently works. And to remember that our market doesn't have to work the way that it does right now, right? If we get rid of all of the institutions that guarantee that our products are what they say they are and that they're safe, then we will have that kind of market. And we might be getting there, right? But we're not there yet, and right now when I buy chicken, I'm pretty sure that it's chicken. And furthermore, this stuff, in its massive aggregation of alternative forms of data to then produce a credit score, is really no different at all from things like this. This is Lendo, an alternative lending app. Again, you can't see what it says there, but this its little graphic is with the kind of happy borrowers on the bottom who have big smiles because they got a loan. It's talking about how it uses browser data, mobile data, social network data, psychometric data to generate an alternative credit score. And again, not to mention this. So here I want to kind of emphasize that the sort of socio-material surround and these norms and practices around payment in China should, sure, we can sound an alarm about privacy and government intrusion and the relationship to the state, but I would just sort of back up and then say, well, what are the problems that this is solving there? And what problems here with these companies are we not paying attention to if we're spending all of our time worrying about Sesame Credit? So that's my anti-Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon thing. I have a BlackBerry, just disclosure, right? So even though it's Android. Third start, cashlessness and the Cambrian Explosion. So this is my last start to the talk. So the third start is the rapid pace at which states and private actors and advocacy organizations and philanthropic organizations are insisting on the dematerialization and the digitalization of all monetary transactions. So-called cashlessness as a kind of agenda. It's on the rise as a development paradigm, the idea being that if we go cashless, then we can formalize informal systems, bring people into the fold of the financial system for the purposes of fill in the blank, for the purposes of safety, security, revenue collection, surveillance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's also kind of put forward as a political move, as a security stance for interdicting counterfeiting or criminal activity or money laundering or tax evasion. If there's a digital record, the idea goes, then you would kind of avoid some of that stuff, even though money launderers do very well using the current electronic payment systems to do their dirty deeds, as well as terrorist financing. It's not all suitcases full of cash. There are Swiss bank accounts, and there are all kinds of things you can do with credit cards, right, and prepaid cards. What's interesting, too, is this is always framed in terms of digitization, often before digital networks have been built out to sustain the kind of transactions that would be expected if you were to go wholly cashless. So, look to what happened with India and demonetization. Demonetization of high denomination banknotes took place before there were even ATMs rolled out to handle the new notes, right? Maybe we should sort of think about that first. Or then go back to China. Everyone sort of says, isn't it amazing how rapidly it worked in China, that cashlessness sort of seems to be on the horizon with these new apps. But people overlook, again, the necessary existing infrastructure that was in place in the form of government-mandated ID, right? So if you have ID, then it's really easy to build banking and payment infrastructure on top of it if you're going to go digital. A big thing for digital is if you want to be in compliance with global standards around anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, you have to tie your digital money to some form of verifiable identification. China had it. India didn't. I often joke, and apologies to Chinese people in the room, that democracy and cashlessness don't actually work very well together. You need sort of authoritarianism first to give you all these mandatory ID cards, and then you can go and build your cashless infrastructure. But alongside this call for cashlessness has come what Lana Swartz and Taylor Nelms and Scott Mainwaring and I have called the Cambrian Explosion in payments. And if you just think back to your evolutionary biology, the Cambrian period on planet Earth was the period of this incredible profusion of different body plans and life forms on the planet. So right now, we have things that are radially symmetrical, like starfish. We have things that are bilaterally symmetrical, like me and you, and like most things that crawl around on the Earth. Like fish and even insects. That's kind of it. I guess we have sort of little sacky things like anemones. In the Cambrian period, there was like tons of different body plans. And we use this metaphor to think about what started happening also around 2008 in concert with the financial crisis in payments. Within the space of a few months, you had the release of the iPhone, and you had the launching of M-Pesa, Kenya's mobile money transfer service that uses basic feature phones and the text message system, the SMS channel, to send money. These all burst on the scene with tons of other things, many of which now are dead, like never really took off or didn't really go anywhere. Like in the upper right corner is Level Up, which looks an awful lot like what WeChat Pay and Alipay became. But this is way before then, and nobody could figure out how it worked. And one of the jokes about Level Up was, so it's called Level Up because as you used it, you would earn loyalty points. Like that was the incentive to use it, you'd earn stuff. And Level Up is basically morphed from being a payment company to being a loyalty company. But people would joke that it was called Level Up because you had to level up the phone just right for it to be able to scan the code, otherwise it wouldn't work. Has anyone here actually ever used Level Up? Yeah, none, zero. Anyway, Level Up. And then, things like Samsung Pay, which there's still giant ads for, but I don't think anybody uses really much, which ingeniously generated a series of pulses to fool a magstripe reader into thinking that there was a magstripe in there, right? Which is brilliant, except that then, right then, all the standard changed over to chip and pin for the US, so oops. Or something like Currency in the lower right, its initial brand name was ISIS, which was kind of bad, oops. And my favorite, and I actually have one of these if you want to take a look at it, Coin, the coin card. This is my coin card. And it would Bluetooth, it's now completely dead, it would Bluetooth to your phone. You'd have all your card information in a wallet in your phone, and then this would rewrite itself. It has a magstripe, an RFID, and an NFC chip inside, and it would sort of rewrite itself to become whatever card that was. So you could swipe it, or you could insert it, or you could tap and pay, and there's a little cool sort of button that's not really a button here that you could push to pick which card. This went nowhere. But also things that went somewhere, like Square, right? And Square is one of my favorite of the innovations of the time because of what it didn't do. It didn't try to do anything crazy like this. It didn't try to ask of users anything new, like level up. Instead, it said, all right, everybody's got phones, everybody's got credit cards. Why don't we treat the phone jack like a data port, the earphone jack like a data port, and make a little card swipey thingy and just let people swipe their magnetic card into their phone and they're good, right? No new movement required, no new technology, just harness part of the existing infrastructure of the phone that's supposed to be for listening to music or whatever, and have it listen to the data in a card. I think I have my poltergeist slide next. Yes, what's happening? So one of the things that interests me so much about this period, this Cambrian explosion, what's been happening in blockchain, what's been happening in China, is these developments really are reopening what had been a rather settled political discussion over what money is. And a standard answer to what's happening right now is the kind of disintermediation of old legacy players or systems, a disintermediation of the card systems by Square jumping in and becoming a payment provider, or Venmo jumping in, of banks, of the central banking system itself. Right? There's this kind of idea that the internet is coming to eat payments. But there's more to it. Almost every time I give a talk about this, and it will probably happen today, someone will always want to come up and talk to me about like the gold standard, and wouldn't it be better if money was just real like gold? Or will want to talk to me about like, but the Fed is like really bad because of whatever, right? That didn't used to happen. Like, it didn't used to be that me as anthropologist of money would talk about something having to do with money, and there would be such passion around the topic. Think about something like the popular novel The Mandibles by Lionel Shriver. If you know it, it's a sort of right-wing libertarian dystopian fantasy. It was written right before the election of 2016, but it predicts a future under Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, and Cory Booker, and then an invented Latino successor to Clinton, and it depicts, of course, the end of the US social order and stability, which is precipitated by the decline of the value of the dollar and a default on the US debt, which is, strangely what's all coming true today under Trump. But what's interesting, though, to me is not necessarily that, but that, again, it's reopening a conversation about what money is. And the assumption somehow, and this is extremely paradoxical, in this age of kind of increasing digitization, more and more people are thinking about money as a commodity. But none of these systems are about money as a commodity. All of these systems are about money as a system of record keeping and accounts. And yet the commodity thing is there. So how do you square this new interest in so-called sound money with the immaterial money of cashlessness? To me, what this means is that we really need to think anew about the infrastructures of cashlessness that make it seem just immaterial, just digital, just virtual. And going back to Brian Cantwell Smith, what are those surrounding structures, routines, and mechanisms of cashlessness? What futures does it wish to bring into being? The thing about cashlessness is, in many respects, shifting into the anthropology and archaeology of the stuff, we've kind of always been cashless. I have a quote from Mitchell Ennis, early 20th century figure thinking about the origins of money, who says, for many centuries we don't know how many, the principal instrument of commerce was neither the coin nor the token, but the tally, right? The tally stick to record transactions. For most of the world's history, money has not been a thing, has not been kind of put into sort of coin form, so to speak, but a set of record-keeping devices for transactions. Basically, as soon as you're in and this is going to be super reductive, I'm sorry, anthropology colleagues, but I'm going to say it anyway. Once you are in a community that's kind of more than 200 or 300 people where you can keep track of stuff in your head, you need to write stuff down somehow. You need something as a mnemonic device to remember kind of relations of credit and debt among people. I'm not talking about sort of a barter thing. I'm just talking about, oh yeah, a few months ago, this person helped me out with whatever. I probably owe them something. I should probably help them out, right? I can keep track of that when it's about us in a room. Make me a small, ancient city-state. I can't do that anymore. I need something or someone to keep track of all of it for me. Denis Schmalm-Besra, archaeologist, has for years been studying these funny little tokens that you find littering the ancient Near East that were, she argues, the earliest form of reckoning of transactions to keep track of things like herds of sheep and bushels of grain and so forth. What she was able to demonstrate is that these things would eventually get impressed into tablets of clay, and from there evolved into elaborate record-keeping systems baked on clay tablets. This is all predating coin, right? This is all predating the sort of stuff that we would consider current money. Instead of kind of physical instantiations of value transfer that pass from hand to hand, which then leads to the kind of monetarist illusion that money is a precious thing in and of itself, you have these record-keeping devices. What do they depend on? Well, someone to keep the records. In this case, a centralized authority, usually a religico-political authority, with a bunch of scribes to do it, who maybe are also enslaved scribes. So we sort of forget that money is simply an accounting device. One thing I love to talk about is some of the earliest minted coins, and here's an example, and I have a couple you can take a look at afterwards. When they started to circulate, initially as tokens to assert political control, right? It was sort of done as a way of insisting on my authority as king. I'm going to give you this token, and at the end of the year, you have to give it back, right? As a kind of tribute. When these things, thereby a market was created in them because you needed to get them to pay your tribute, people started circulating and created a market for these new coins. Folks still didn't quite get how it was supposed to work, right? Think about how hard it is if you're coming from a world of this to go into a world where something is supposed to go from hand to hand and value is magically transferred. If I hand you a banknote, why is it yours, right? That's really weird. If we come from a world and a system where there's a piece of clay or paper that says that banknote is Bill's, and I hand it to Alf, it's still Bill's, right? So what did these people do with these coins? You can see they put little marks all over them. They wrote all over them, signifying, endorsing over to the next person, this was mine, but now it's this other person's. I'm giving it up to that person. Right? It's totally fascinating to me. So whoops. This is going to be about slavery. Okay. Fast forward. These things are also obviously always about power, and I just talked about kind of the political control over record keeping in the ancient Near East. This was always about power here too. This is Michael O'Malley's book, Face Value, about the entwined histories of money and race in this country. There were sort of key political idioms through which authority in this country was maintained, and they were about race and they were about gender, among other things. Take the antebellum period here. Despite the gold standard at the time, what really fueled the economy was a kind of cashlessness, right? The unpaid labor of enslaved Africans, who were a source of value backing monetary affairs in the US and productive of new value. Michael O'Malley shows slavery and the gold standard were completely entwined with one another and linked with an overarching moral order. And it's not too difficult to hear the resonances with contemporary politics. Senator George Hoare from Massachusetts, in a speech before Congress, said, "A sound currency is to the affairs of this life what a pure religion and a sound system of morals are to the affairs of the spiritual life." And you got campaign posters like this coming into the post-war period, where McKinley challenged and won against William Jennings Bryan. McKinley, sort of a supporter of not just the gold standard, but the gold standard and racialized imperialism. And McKinley kind of making the case for opening up the basis of money. Let it be silver too, not just because the Comstock lode had been discovered, right, of silver in Nevada, but because of this kind of understanding that money really is a system of reckoning, not a God-given system of truth from above. Just a few quotes from the time. So gold standard proponents would castigate their opponents in explicitly racist terms. They were called peons, coolies, and rancheros. There was the association of gold with civilization and progress, as well as manifest destiny. What you have on this poster is kind of poster on the one side. It's like, if McKinley wins and the Republicans win, you'll have industry and a run to the bank and American rule in Cuba. And if Bryan wins, you'll have a run on the bank. You'll have these idle factories, right? On the right side, the factories are all humming. On the left side, they're all just sitting there doing nothing. So, you've got this sense of imperialism and divinely ordained progress, global expansion in the name of moral uplift, all bundled up with a debate on money, a debate on currency. For McKinley and Bryan, accounting in gold or silver wasn't just a technical decision delimited by technical constraints, like the opening of the West by the railroads and so forth. It was about sort of post-Reconstruction America and racial hierarchy, those technical constraints and human decisions intertwined with broader structures and political philosophies. So let's bring this back to the present with things like Bitcoin, but also things like the dominant form of electronic value transfer today, the automated clearinghouse. I take a sip of water. I think that Lana will agree with me that the automated clearinghouse is our favorite payments thing.
I'll think about it.
She's thinking about it. So the ACH, the automated clearinghouse, is the interbank clearance and settlement system for retail payments, okay? What does that mean? It's the thing that makes sure that when your paycheck is direct deposited or you have a direct bill pay for your electricity bill, it's the thing that makes sure that that happens, okay? It's kind of an amazing thing. It links all the banks and credit unions together to let all that work. This is a hilarious object. This is a paper printout of an ACH transaction on a piece of black velvet under glass in a little part of the Atlanta Fed's Monetary Museum. All the Federal Reserve banks have a little money museum. The Atlanta Fed's is worth going to, okay? The main gallery is like totally straight, just the Museum of Money, whatever, right? All the stuff that you would have. Then there's this funny little side gallery, and it says the Museum from the Future of Money, okay? And you walk in, and boom, what happens? This big flat screen comes up, and a woman from the future appears, and she is, of course, wearing a white unitard, which is what we will all wear in the future. And she says, "Welcome to the Museum of the Future of Money. I will explain to you how people paid for things in the 20th century." And she explains what coins, cash, checks, and the ACH are. And it's awesome. And displayed as reverently displayed on velvet behind glass with like lights is like a penny and like a dollar and like a check and a printout, a piece of paper printed out of an ACH transaction. So what's interesting about the ACH? All right, so what's interesting about the ACH is it was created to solve an economic problem and a political problem. So in the early part of the 20th century, and one of the mandates of the Federal Reserve when it came into being was to sort of unify payment processes throughout the country, there was a particular problem, which was that banks in some parts of the country were charging interchange fees. This is where we get the word interchange from now on credit cards, on checks that were coming from out of state. And the argument was, oh, well, there's all these costs associated with these checks because they're coming from far, far away, blah, 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 right? The Fed very early on recognized that the argument about distance did not hold water. What you've got here is shading based on the percentage of banks that were non-par, that is, would charge interchange on these checks. California and Nevada had no problem, even though they were far, far away from the centers of banking in New York. What do you see? Except for the weird old Northwest, it's the South. So what do you think was going on there? That was a really, really interesting history of banking post-Reconstruction in the early part of the 20th century, where basically banks were involved in the perpetuation of old inequalities and coming up with techniques to exclude certain people from the banking infrastructure. The Fed mandated that this stop, right? And this was a huge, long process, and a lot of anti-Federal Reserve rhetoric that is still around today comes from here. And it's kind of amazing to read the histories of this period because there were like gunfights and everything, right? Like the feds from the Fed would show up and like people would get their gun, like bankers would get their guns and whole 9 yards. I don't want to go too much further into this, but I do want you to see that this end of non-par banking, the end of interchange that mapped onto the old Confederacy is again another one of these kind of things around the making of an infrastructure where we see the interpenetration of politics, forms, and systems that make payment go. Now let me talk a little bit about what kind of record it is. This is what an ACH file looks like. So the first thing about the ACH is it's accounts-based. So it's just like double entry, right? You have like accounts, and you're just sort of moving things from one account to another. There are time delays built into it. And people today will say, oh, but I want my money to happen instantly, but there's time delays for a reason, in case there are errors and to allow for the reversibility of transactions. There's also an upper bound to the amount that can be transferred. Now, many of you might think if you tried to do like large transfers before that the upper bound is 10 grand. That's set by regulation. There's actually a technical upper bound, and it's 9,999,999.99. And that's because an ACH data file is a fixed width alphanumeric document. Each line is always 94 characters in length. Punch card buffs, like you should be hearing something here. They tried to work with the IBM 80 character, 80 whole thing. That wasn't quite enough. They moved up to the 96 standard. That was too much, and also the cards with that many holes in them kind of they weren't durable enough. They wouldn't last for the kinds of transactions that you're dealing with here, right? People's money. So they made their own. And they made their own punch card right at the moment when computing was shifting over entirely into magnetic tape. So even though they didn't have to do it that way anymore, they kept it anyway, and we still have that standard. And so as a result, there's still the 9,999,999 limit, which is like super interesting. I'll come back to this at the end. Is there a way that we can sort of use that unexpected, unintended affordance of this technology to do something now, right? There are many calls for things like taxes on financial transactions, and everybody says, oh, it's not going to be easy to implement, or how would you decide how to do it, Just take 9,999,999. Go from there. The system's already built to deal with that as a breakpoint. Might want to sort of hold on to it. And again, here is an instance of that kind of material and immaterial intermingling in ways that you would never expect unless you went and looked at the old punch cards for the ACH and tried to understand why they adopted 94 characters and what that did. Let's talk just briefly about Bitcoin for a second. So we have with the ACH a ledger, but that's accounts-based. What do we have with Bitcoin? How does a Bitcoin transaction happen? People talk about them as if they're happening on a single digital ledger, which makes it sound like it's also an accounts-based system, like the ACH or double entry. But there's some interesting differences. So Lana and I have written with another colleague about how early Bitcoin proponents were what we called digital metalists, which was interesting because of the way that it implied a politics. Again, sound money, gold standard, anti-Fed, anti-fractional reserve banking, and so forth. But they actually coded that into the systems themselves. So Bitcoin transactions are not about sort of following transactions in a ledger from me to you to her to him and so forth. Instead, it's a system really for tracing the provenance of specific instances of like digital cash. And these things are called unspent transaction outputs, UTXOs. And it's basically a system for tracking those UTXOs. What's interesting about UTXOs is they're unique and indivisible, right? Again, like a hunk of gold. If you have a hunk of gold and I want to pay you with some gold, I need to get a pickaxe and like split it and do it. Digitally, that's what's happening in a Bitcoin transaction. This is a little attempt to graphically represent it. Basically, if I want to send Lana 2 Bitcoin, you're welcome. The network basically looks for, all right, what are my unspent transaction outputs? What have I got? And let's say that I have 0.4, 1.1, and 0.8. It knows that I need to have 2 to give over to Lana. So what it does is it creates 2 new ones, right? It creates a 2 and then a 0.5, which then it gives back to me, right? So every transaction is not just signing over, these aren't fungible. It's not saying Bill has 2.5, just sign over 2 of them to Lana. It's saying, here are these things, let's now get rid of them and create 2 new ones, pay one, I'm gonna pay one back to myself, and the other one to Lana. What's, again, interesting to me about that, if you contrast the ACH with Bitcoin, is we have an account-based thing versus a thing that uses discrete, non-fungible digital objects. In an accounts-based thing, we have reversibility, right? We can go back and change it. Once I've done this, I can't go back and put together those pieces of 8 again, right? They're gone. We've got irreversibility. And then we have, with the ACH, real fungibility. With this system, we don't have that fungibility anymore. We have something else, a sort of weird uniqueness, a kind of the literary critic Walter Ben Michaels writing in a whole other context, writing about 19th century literature and its infatuation with the gold standard, called it a logic of naturalism, that there should be this sort of natural given entity holding value in itself. And then how is the record maintained? So for the ACH, it's maintained by a consortia of banks and credit unions, a set of rules that is produced by the banks and credit unions themselves through a multi-party agency called NACHA, the National ACH Association, and regulatory requirements, right? This is a thing that sort of seeped in law, policy, and self-governance mechanisms. For Bitcoin, many of you probably know, at least in theory, it's a thing that's maintained by a network of clients or a network of nodes that are incentivized to verify transactions, bundling them into blocks, posting the blocks to the network, and letting kind of the consensus of the network determine which is true and which is not. What's interesting to me about that is if we think about the ACH as coming, I already put it in its context of the history of the Federal Reserve, coming from a place of government regulation and management of the platform on which a capitalist economy can then do whatever it wants to do. What we have with Bitcoin is something else. Built right into the code are specific pieces of political philosophy that it's important to just notice and think about, because these are things that are not just in Bitcoin, but also in my Android phone and in all of our computational systems. So first, one of the things built into Bitcoin to kind of incentivize people to do the work of transaction verification, but also make it not that easy, right? Kind of make it a little bit of a challenge, is there's a proof of work mechanism built in. The computer science people in the room will know what this is. But where does it come from? Where it comes from is this foundational work by people like Cynthia Dwork and Moni Noor, who also worked with David Chaum, a big digital money proponent back in the day, on spam in email, right? What was the problem with email in the beginning of email? There was no cost to sending it. So spammers could send out millions and millions and millions of messages hoping to get you to do something stupid, right? Dwork and Noor proposed a kind of proof of work, a postage stamp, right? Let's just put in a little thing, just spin a few more extra cycles, gobble up some computational time to make it, just a tiny little bit more computationally expensive to send an email. If it's you and me, we're not even going to notice. If it's some spammer wanting to send out 1 million messages a minute, it's going to really gobble up all their time. It's going to gobble up all their cycles, and they're not going to be able to do it. Where does that idea come from? Well, this is a quote from their foundational paper. The main idea is to require a user to compute a moderately hard but not intractable function in order to gain access to the resource, thus preventing frivolous use. That's right out of Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons thesis. Right? Garrett Hardin writing about common property problems, common resource management problems, the seas, the skies, the forests, and saying, Hardin writes, freedom in the commons is ruin to all. If you allow everybody access to the commons, everybody naturally will want to gobble up all the resources and get as much as they can for themselves, right? The thing with the Hardin thesis is we could easily imagine other things to do to prevent us all from gobbling up all the resources, right? We could create like a collective organization that would settle who gets what, when, and where, or assign things based on need, et cetera, et cetera. The last example that I'll give here of this kind of political philosophy and code is the Bitcoin system also basically uses a market model, right? It creates a market to get people to have the incentive to do the work of verifying transactions. Where does this come from? This comes from also classic papers in computer science by people like Miller and Drexler on agoric systems, and here you'll see them talking about another problem, the problem of allocation of computing power in a system, where they basically say the problems of social and computational coordination are fundamentally similar. Concrete parallels, however, are rough. Memory space is a bit like land, or perhaps a raw material. Processor time is somewhat like labor or like fuel. Software objects are like workers, or perhaps like managers or firms. Right? You go from this to essentially electronic bidding systems within our devices for computational cycles or for electrical power. Right? Totally fine to manage how our systems work. Interestingly, this very market-oriented idea to solve one set of problems in computing comes right back in to then be the foundation of a problem for digital money, incentivization for a transaction verification. So these sort of political philosophies matter, I think. I have a quote here from my colleague Paul Dorish at UC Irvine. But really, I just want to amplify his point here. It's not just that the digital always relies on material infrastructures or political philosophies, but that those infrastructures and philosophies provide constraints on those systems. They shape those systems in very real and powerful ways, and then set them forward down particular tracks. And we want to understand why we have those tracks, and understand those tracks as coming from some of these political decisions. So, yeah, that's what I want to say there. And, go back. Come back. There, all right. So I'm just about finished. Just as virtual objects manifest as states with material constraints, Dorish says, so too objects that we deem material, physical, like my banknote that we feel, but we're not really feeling it. Our cells is getting embedded into the thing. Things we deem material can manifest as immaterial depending on particular constraints. So, for instance, many of the material objects signifying the power of money were actually made to be seen, not felt, made to be like sort of visual displays, to prevent spectacles, to dazzle the observer, and sometimes to obfuscate the bearer. When a high-ranking person in the Andes between 100 BCE and 300 CE wore an elaborate nose ornament like this, attached, okay, these things are intense, attached to the septum, so your nose, your septum, goes like there. There, the whole thing is in front of my face and around it. Very heavy object. When they wore these things covering the mouth, and there's all these little dangling pieces, all the pieces in this move, the glint from the dangling pieces and the small hoops would shimmer and make noise. Ear spools from which hung large gold discs created a similar effect. From a distance, the wearer of these objects would appear to be possessed, says the art historian Pillsbury, of a luminous power. Right? there's an artistic tradition during the time of the great currency debates in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century, trompe-l'oeil money painting. And this is an example, John Haberly in 1888. This piece is called Can You Break a Five? And it's kind of like our Bitcoin problem, right? You can't break that five. There's a little bit of writing underneath his glasses, and the glasses, of course, calling attention to the trompe-l'oeil effect, but also the idea that not everything you see can be believed. And it says, entirely with a brush and with the naked eye, imitation by John Haberly is one of those clever pieces of artistic mechanism showing an old greenback and other objects, unquote. Works like this call attention to the fiction of money, but more that traffic between the material and the immaterial that I've been concerned with today. Haberly here is reflecting on what it is we see when we see money, and in so doing asks us to see it again afresh, to see its own artistic mechanism, and I'd say its political mechanisms. Now, if Andean slaves at the start of the first millennium would need to tear those nose masks from the faces of their overlords to begin to challenge the luminous power of their authority and thus unseat the theory of vision sustaining that power, perhaps what we need to do is engage in a kind of haptic exploration of the money things animating our world. This would entail a kind of remembering of ourselves, a re-embedding of ourselves as beings always becoming in and with that world, digital or otherwise, muddling inside and outside of those digital worlds, rather than simply submitting to money things, the digital or the material, and their abstract authority to determine our lives and our wills. Thank you. I know I went on for a little bit long. Thanks. Am I taking questions from here? I'm taking questions from here.
So I'll just
Okay.
point out. All right, so we'll take some questions. Yes.
So how does the history of counterfeiting follow the invention of new types of money?
So the question is, how does the history of counterfeiting follow the invention of new types of money? And it's, I mean, in the digital world, people will always say that, before you've even kind of imagined and put out your new thing, the hackers are already there and have already been thinking about it. What's interesting to me in the sort of physical media of money space is it really doesn't take much. Like, the whole issue with a counterfeit is as long as it functions, it's fine, right? It's only when it's caught that it ceases to be a medium of exchange. Like, that's the weird thing about counterfeits. They can keep circulating, and when they're circulating, they're still money until somebody is like, wait a minute. And then what happens to that somebody who says, wait a minute? They're kind of SOL, right? They're supposed to report it, which they do, but then what do they get? Nothing. They get thank you for your service and whatever. It's interesting that in the digital space, there are interesting things around kind of, counterfeiting involving like magstripe cards, right? So skimming magstripe and duplicating. But what's interesting about those things is often it's not making it's not making a fake one. It's just copying an existing one that then will work within whatever kind of technological system that one requires. More and more I see things where it's not so much sort of the electronic currency system that is where something is being counterfeited. It's those sort of entry points and exit points to them that are incredibly vulnerable and that people try to exploit more. So again, to take the cryptocurrency example, it's almost always been the exchanges that are the sites of fraudulent activity, not like the distributed ledger itself.
Other questions?
So, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about is the dominance of double entry computing as a pattern, right? And looking at books from like Victorian period, you realize that double entry computing is actually didn't exist, right? In fact, it was multiple entry computing. And I'm thinking about the way in which how people told to think about records of payments, but they were deliberately not double. Multiple, and so I think so one of the interesting things is totally about the Bitcoin. One of the things about Bitcoin is this sort of the need for verifiability, right? While we're also talking about transactions that can't go backwards, right? And so it is interesting to think about laying that again. It's something that happens very early and not
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question. The question is sort of about double entry bookkeeping and the fact that when you sort of look at many actual contexts, you didn't even really have that. You had like multiple books happening and people often going back and revising their entries and da-da-da. And then in relation to Bitcoin, where it's sort of this, in theory, distributed ledger that's collectively maintained, that's sort of very forward going. Everything new is appended onto it and you can't go back and change an old record. To me, what's interesting about that, again, is that, just to kind of be a little bit meta about it, is it shows that each of these systems is animated by different sort of moral and political principles, right? In double entry bookkeeping, yeah, or there may be multiple books and there may be fraudulent entries and maybe people are going back and changing stuff all the time. But what really matters in that context is that you're participating in a community of merchants and bankers, all of whom have ongoing relationships with one another that are based on this weird thing called trust that somehow is signified by the books, even if the books are BS, right? I got the books. And so, there's sort of great work in the history of this stuff where, nice, neat books like mattered. Didn't necessarily matter if like you had lied in them. The fact that they kind of had that form itself carried the weight that you were a merchant of character, right? And double entry comes out of this old, kind of tradition via the church of accounting for one's own activities for the purposes of a moral reckoning with God. So it comes out of that world. What's the world that Bitcoin comes out of? It comes out of this really weird techno-libertarian crazy thing of of wanting there to be the kind of irreducible uniqueness of digital things, right? A kind of digital naturalism or something that's really kind of strange, and the idea that we like can't be trusted. And so we need a thing into which we offload our trust. And because we can't be trusted to go and like change the books later, we need a thing that is durable and permanent and unalterable and blah, 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 blah. And that unalterability is truth, right? And that's, again, kind of weird because in most of our like Western religious traditions, we don't actually think of unalterability as truth. We think that like truth is arrived at by like debate and exegesis and, there's all that kind of stuff because we can never put ourselves in the place of God and truly know God one-to-one, right? So what do? We kind of fight over it in a lot of the traditions that we have. Scientific truth is also never seen as non-irrevisable, right? It has to be revisable. So it's just sort of like weird and interesting that they had that idea. And then where does that idea come from, right? If you think again about the post-financial crisis world and about the antecedents to the rise of what people are calling populism today, it's about kind of the crisis of faith in various institutions for all kinds of reasons we can talk about, but some of which I think are just like, stupid racism, just to So I kind of love the Fed and, whatever, and I often have to like disclose that because we forget that, the Fed does all kinds of other things besides monetary policy. That's the thing that we see and that we always talk about. We forget about the role of the Federal Reserve in maintaining the soundness of the payments infrastructure so that we can have capitalism, right? It's like that simple. And yet, like that is seen as extremely controversial because it's like stomping on my freedom to do whatever I want with whoever I want and public lands that should be mine. Sorry for the caricature.
Do we have time for one more? Yeah, great.
Yeah, so I agree that blockchain or Bitcoin in general considers liquor technology in general developed in the worst like also saying, yeah. I mean, I think Bitcoin is a whole
Probably yes. Big, huge bubble. I mean, you know, are there things that, so there's a bunch of things. First of all, for most of the things that are happening in the distributed ledger space right now, if you look at the various ICOs, you know, some of them might have like a proof of concept, but hardly any of them have a proof of product. It's like, to me, that's like danger, Will Robinson, you know. The next thing is like, so is there a thing and does it work? Then do we really need that thing? Like, so there's many things that are being put out there where it's like, well, why do we need that? We actually already have an intermediary that works quite fine, that's great, and maybe we want to keep it, right, for various reasons. The things that I always think are, like, when I allow myself to be like, ooh, that's actually pretty cool, or that should have legs, those things never seem to have legs, but they're all things where you actually do have like a giant multi-party coordination problem with no existing intermediary to do stuff, and it's just a complete mess. And and when you have the parties where everybody has basically competing interests because they have the same interests. So an example is just any kind of supply chain, right? You have, let's just take romaine lettuce. You have all of your producers of romaine lettuce. They are all competing with each other, right? They all want their romaine in my shopping cart. But in order to get it there, they all have to kind of cooperate, and they all have to ensure the kind of soundness of the things in the supply chain, because if there's tainted romaine, I'm not just going to stop buying like his romaine, I'm going to stop buying all romaine, right? There's an instance where you would think that some kind of system that they all could use together would actually like be kind of a good thing. Or another example that I kind of always gravitate to is you know, organic food labeling, right? So it's a complete mess right now. There's no way that it's done. Again, all the parties have competing and contending interests. It's a giant multi-party coordination problem. And you know, there's that little kind of quip that people always make that there's more organic food sold in the US than is actually produced. So, you know, there's a lot of fakes out there. So that's another one where you would think that this would be a thing where it would go. This is another reason why I'm so intrigued by some of what's happening in China. So, you know, in China, where you do have a lot of concern, you know, everyday consumer concern over fake goods and fake food and you would think that this would be a thing that could be used for that, but we're still not really seeing it, right? So, and then the question is, why are we not really seeing it? Because you can make a whole lot more money putting out BS on a white paper. I mean, that's what I think. My students this summer were, it was so great because they were like so smart, and also like they were coming at it from the computer science side, and they were seeing these business cases, and they were like, Professor Maurer, like, this is crap. Right? And they were kind of like horrified. They're like, this is just like not real. I'm like, yeah, ding, 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 yes. And I had to have the whole talk about how just because things are not real doesn't mean we shouldn't be studying them. There are a lot of things that aren't real, and you know, blah, 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 blah.
I am so tempted to jump in and start giving my opinion of upcoming research, which makes
What do you think, Lana?
Yeah, which makes me, that gives me the cue that it's time to perhaps advertise the salon that Professor Maurer, will be participating in tomorrow, and close things, and also note that Professor Maurer will be hanging out for a short period to chat, and there will be a reception call as well. So.
Do you need to tell them that, or is he going to?
And I think you know the details on the locations of those things, or I can read them.
Apparently it's that way. It's a round building, it's hard.
The anthropology, yeah. And then the salon is a small group, but if anyone is very passionate, I think that we can, to speak with Bill Maurer more, I think that we can make room for you, just let us know. And yeah, so just reach out to one of the organizers and we can figure out a way to include you, I'm sure. And with that, let's thank Professor Maurer.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Thanks, Lana.